Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's my great pleasure to have Diane Coyle, Professor Diane Coyle, with us today. Well, not literally with us, unfortunately. You can see we've got different backdrops. Diane's been a fellow at Churchill for the last 3 years, fairly exactly, I think. I will look forward to discussing how she got from where she started to where she is now. Can I say that at this point that if questions come to you during the conversation, please enter them in the Q&A chat as we go through, and we'll get to them at the end. But often I think people forget the questions they had. So I'd encourage you to type them in as we go. So Diane, I mean, if you look at your Wikipedia page entry or something, you look like a terribly establishment figure, all the things you've done, Oxford, Harvard, and now Cambridge via establishment things like the BBC. But I know you have been, you've described your background as growing up in a grimy Lancashire town. So what was your background? What was your upbringing like that led you to do all the things you've done?
I want to start by saying thank you to people who are spending most of their days online and decide that listening to me talk about myself is a useful hour spent online again. So thank you all very much. I grew up in a Lancashire mill town called Ramsbottom, and in the 1970s there were something like 30 cotton mills there, from spinning and weaving to dyeing. The River Irwell used to turn whatever colour the dye works tipped into it that day. And my father had worked in a spinning mill until it closed in 1978 and became a meter reader. My mother worked in the mills and then became a secretary. And the thing that really determined the course of my life from that background was the 11+ system and getting into grammar school. My siblings are much older than me, and they made it easy for me to follow through the same route. So I got into the local grammar school, and once you were on that, it was a conveyor belt into university. So my two brothers went to Manchester Grammar, went to Oxford. My sister went to another local grammar, went to Oxford. So I got into a grammar school and went to Oxford because, as far as my immediate family was concerned, that was what you did. I think, though, it's probably quite unusual for 4 people from our background to have got all to Oxford, and 3 of us have got PhDs, and 2 of us in academic roles. So it was a very working class upbringing, and has left me with the kind of insecurities that you have from going from that kind of background to meeting all the posh people who were totally alien to my world when I arrived in Oxford in 1978.
Were your parents very keen that you all went to university, let alone Oxford? Because I mean, the statement about first from the family to go to university, which presumably your older brother was, often it seems to have been something of a challenge for them to convince their parents, for instance, that they should go.
They were bemused. I'm sure my father would rather we'd gone out to work and done a proper job and been earning money sooner. My mother was very determined that we would get opportunities that she wished she'd had and never had herself. She got forced to leave school, even though she could easily have stayed on and gone to university and went out to work. And for both my parents, they were the generation when getting into the army during the Second World War was a sort of liberation from quite constrained backgrounds, but they came back to their northern mill town roots.
But still, 4 of you going to Oxford does seem unusual, as you say, extremely unusual. So what was it about your schooling? I mean, you went to 3 different schools, so it wasn't simply one wonderful head teacher or something. It was different routes, as it were.
Yes, and we all chose different subjects, and my one brother and my sister chemists. My other brother read history and then became an accountant later. And I was determined as a teen to become a new Simone de Beauvoir. I grew up, I'd never travelled abroad. We didn't have exotic holidays. And so my idea of the most glamorous thing that you could do came from the accident of getting a book on existentialism out of the school library and learning about Simone de Beauvoir, spending her days sitting in a pavement cafe in Paris writing books. And I thought that seemed a really very good idea. So I applied to read PPE, and I was sure that I was going to do that, become a philosopher. And in one of the many lessons in my life about how things just totally happen by accident, my economics tutor, Peter Sinclair at Brasenose, who was sadly one of the early victims of the COVID pandemic, was just an absolutely genius teacher, and inspired in me the vocation really for economics that has taken me through all the various episodes of my life ever since. That's been the constant feature. So there was an inspirational teacher. It just came a little bit later. And you know, as far as getting to university and getting to Oxford was concerned, for me as the baby of the family, it was just what you did. It was.
Well, that certainly must make it easier, but nevertheless, for a girl to aspire to study philosophy must have been fairly odd, actually. I mean, were you at girls' grammar? I think you said you were.
Yeah. Girls' grammar, but and obviously being at a girls' school certainly helped. I think there's, you know, quite a lot of good evidence about the beneficial effects for girls of being at a girls' school. But I was just slightly weird anyway. I didn't really bother what people thought about me, and had been quite solitary, which I think comes from being the youngest by a very long way, not having immediate siblings. And I was also a very ill baby and spent quite a bit of time in hospital as a very young child. And so I was just sort of, didn't really mind what people thought about me and did the things that interested me. And that was probably quite painful as an adolescent, as far as I can remember, when you absolutely want to conform with your peers, and that wasn't going to be possible in my case. But the older you get, the more of an advantage that kind of independence of spirit seems.
Yes, I absolutely recognise exactly what you describe in different ways, having gone to a girls' grammar. What made me different was I was significantly younger than my cohort. I was bumped up a year and was young anyhow in my own year. And so I couldn't possibly fit in with my cohort because they were really adolescent when I was, you know, hardly into my teens. And so I was always the one who walked alone, as it were. And I think that does give you an advantage. And well, maybe we both ended up in subjects that aren't traditionally subjects full of women.
The advantages later, obviously. I mean, I was bumped up a year as well, and so I was wandering around being really interested in Henry VII's policies, and when all my peers in my class were getting into boys and makeup.
Yes, absolutely. The only place I found common ground was over my music, actually, which was what saved me as a confused adolescent, certainly, and was a good counterpart to physics. But still, to come back to the philosophy, what excited you about philosophy when you were 16?
I'm not sure I can really remember. And when I got to university, I found that I was very bad at philosophy, or I thought I was bad at philosophy. It frustrated me. It was people bothering about subtle meanings of words when actually the meaning should have been perfectly obvious, and why were they finicking around about the language? So I found it quite frustrating when I finally got there and discovered a philosophy. So the philosophers that I enjoyed learning about, it was David Hume, who obviously did lots of political economy as well, and that was practical empirical stuff that I could get my head around. And so I think the philosophy was just a teenage dream that came from, you know, the one book in the library and images from TV and movies of what Paris looked like. And when I did finally get abroad, which was after my first year in university, I went straight to Paris to check it out and spend my meager money on sitting in some pavement cafes drinking coffee and failing to have the deep thoughts that I'd anticipated.
No, but Paris is a wonderful city to visit, no doubt about it. There are lots of good places to sit and drink coffee. So once you hadn't done any economics before you went to Oxford?
No, and that was, and I think probably still is, an advantage in some ways. I'd done maths and history, and between them, I think they're a really good grounding for economics.
Yes. So you were well set up and you were confident. I mean, like, you can't do economics without maths O level, can you? That would be fantastic.
You used to be able to. I would think not anymore.
I mean, I suppose you could maybe do PPE because you assume you were not going down the E route, but yes. And the economics just took off because of your teacher, or because anyhow, you would always have been interested, do you think?
I suppose I had an aptitude for it. And the famous Robert Heilbronner book talks about economists as worldly philosophers. And that was the aspect that appealed to me. It was a framework for thinking about what was going on in the world. And so for anybody then or now, who's any young person who's got a sense of injustice about the way things are, or interest in how our society fits together, economics is just a great lens for thinking about that in quite a rigorous, analytical, empirical way. And so I guess that was my predisposition to liking it. But even then, the maths put lots of people off who were doing PPE. So that was an early dividing line. And the great thing about teachers like Peter Sinclair is that they spot the sparks of interest and they figure out how to make them blaze. And he was a teacher of commitment and genius. He spent hours talking to people who had an interest, breakfast tutorials in the market cafe. So he'd start work at 8 with students, and turned out to have trained a huge number of the applied economists working in the UK and overseas now. So, you know, the absolute outpouring of grief when he died early last year, you know, was phenomenal.
And presumably you didn't know that when you chose Brasenose.
No, I chose it because my brother had been there. You know, BNC is the acronym Boring Northern Chemists, and he was indeed one of those boring.
Okay, I hadn't associated chemistry with Brasenose, but fair enough.
It was one of the early colleges to be mixed as well, and having been to a girls' school, I was jolly well going to go to a mixed college.
It was later than Churchill, that's for sure. Churchill was 72. It was
5.
Yes. Okay. Did you feel it was alien?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So it was a total culture shock, and I panicked a lot about not knowing anything. The culture of the great majority of undergraduates who'd been to a private school in the South and came from middle class backgrounds and had a confidence about social interactions that I totally lacked, partly from being boring and northern and partly from being so young, because I was 17 when I went to Oxford.
Oh gosh, you didn't take a gap year then?
No. And then everything like, why are there so many knives and forks on the table? What do you do with them all? What is an artichoke? How on earth do you deal with this bizarre thing? So the whole thing was a culture shock. And but I loved it. I loved the intellectual environment. It was a sociable, friendly college, and you know, young people are adaptable. And
so if you used the wrong knife and fork, no one was horrid to you?
No, people would very kindly tell you which ones to start with.
So it wasn't the most traditional of Oxbridge colleges then?
No, and I think that being mixed early had something to do with that. It changed the character of the applicants, and it changed the atmosphere within college. And I suspect that if I had somehow ended up in one of the more traditional ones, not that I could have, it would have been a much more difficult experience. And, you know, it has to be said, some people from non-traditional backgrounds, as it were, non-Oxbridge backgrounds, do find it really difficult to make the adjustment, as we all know.
Yeah, I think that can still be the case. And I'd like to think it was one of the great things about Churchill that by and large, we're not. I mean, I know some people mourn the fact we don't have more traditions, but, you know, in a way that lets everyone be themselves and not worry. I mean, I'm sure freshers arriving here still do worry, which knife and fork do I use? But, you know, I think we are relatively relaxed. I feel that's a real positive. No, so long since I've dined anywhere, I don't know. But if you went to some of the more traditional colleges here, I suspect it might still be more intimidating than I hope Churchill is.
Yes, I still get intimidated by dinners in some colleges, I have to say. Ostensibly a grown-up.
Well, there's part of me that thinks one never really grows up. There's always the scared teenager lurking somewhere inside. So yeah. Okay, well, you survived Oxford, you thrived at Oxford, obviously, and you then went off to Harvard, which is another very traditional sort of, I don't know, not exactly middle class, but aspiring kind of thing to do. Why Harvard?
Oh, that was the first of the complete accidents, I suppose. There was somebody in the year ahead of me who had applied for a Kennedy scholarship and got one to go to Harvard. And I thought, well, if he can do that, I can do that. And so I put in my application and was actually horrified when they offered me a place in a scholarship, and thought, I can't really not go. I better go and do this, but it's a terrifying prospect. And
but you had the confidence to apply, and having seen someone else do it and think you could do it too. I mean, that's quite a vote of confidence in yourself, instead of thinking, oh, I'm not like him.
I suppose it is. I hadn't thought about it. And it was a great experience. It's probably the hardest I've ever worked doing a PhD at all, doing it from having a weaker background in economics than some of the other people who turned up. And so I'm doing it in 4 years. So it was a really intense period, but also a fantastic one. So living abroad for the first time is a great experience. Cambridge Mass is lovely, and it's the easy way to learn about America, to be in a city like Boston or Cambridge. So I had a fantastic time there, made a network of friends who I'm still in touch with. And economics is such a US-centric subject that it's actually a real advantage to have been trained there and be part of those networks. So it was a great experience despite all the hard work.
I mean, you would have had a very different background having done PPE rather than, when I say no, American students have a very broad undergraduate curriculum. So who were the ones who were so well grounded in economics?
The difference tended to be mathematical ability. And so most of my contemporaries had done more maths, more matrix algebra, were handier with their integration than I was. So I struggled to keep up with all of that. And although US undergraduate education is very broad, I suppose it's the selectivity of graduate school that people just forge ahead really quickly, and you're among a really impressive group of peers.
And you have to do a year of coursework first, don't you?
Yes. Yes. Actually, one of my courses was taught by Frank Hahn, who was visiting that year, taught microeconomic theory, and that was a terrifying class because I really had no idea what he was talking about most of the time. I very much struggled with that.
And I'd be right in thinking he was here for many years, wasn't he? Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think, well, what do you feel about following in his footsteps then here?
Yes, well, that's one of the bits of economics that I don't do, the more theoretical, mathematical parts of the subject. And, we can perhaps talk about economics, the character of economics a bit later, but I'm a much more applied kind of person.
Yeah. So, I mean, Boston is a lovely city, but you presumably could have stayed in the States had you wanted. Were you tempted?
I was tempted, and I applied for jobs at universities and got a couple of offers. I decided in the end I wanted to be back in the UK and back in Europe. I felt European because the places I was looking at working, I felt I would have to live in a kind of enclave. I didn't like the divisions that were already really apparent in American society in the mid-1980s. It was the Reagan era. Sense that you could have a really comfortable life and career, but only at the price of cutting yourself off essentially from lots of other citizens. I just didn't like the divisions. I'd been offered a job at the Treasury before I left, so I came back into that job and started out in the Treasury. And, as we were talking about earlier, one of the many, many things that I've done that you can do as an economist in my various episodes.
Yes, I mean, the Treasury is presumably where all economists who want to go into the civil service aspire to, kind of thing. And it is, from the outside, it looks like very much the dominant department in government terms.
It is.
But what were your feelings about it when you were there?
It was a great learning experience. I learned an awful lot about how government works and policy and politics, and also about how the UK economy works, because that was my first real experience discovering the detailed economic statistics that we have in the UK, and understanding some recent economic history. It was at that time a very hierarchical organisation. I think that's changed a lot. But for example, notes that went around used to have a circulation list in order that people would read them. And they had titles, Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so. And I said, I don't want to be Miss So-and-so, I want to be Ms. And they said, no, you can't do that. And so I said, in that case, I'll be Doctor. And it turned out that my immediate boss and I were the only doctorates in our division, the two women, both PhDs. So it was Mr., Doctor, which was rather enjoyable. But it sort of set the tone for the fact that I wasn't going to fit into that kind of hierarchy. I really disliked not having responsibility for my own work, and so I left quite swiftly. But I'm really glad I did it, because I learned so much, including that meta knowledge about politics and policy.
Yes, well, I mean, you've obviously stayed close to that in many ways. So would you recommend a brief spell as a civil servant then? Is that a good stepping stone?
It's for some people, it's more than a stepping stone. It's a great career. And if you have that sense of public service as an economist in government, or any other research specialist in government, you can potentially make a difference to things. But it does require a non-stroppy personality, I suppose, to fit in well. And
you would say academia, stroppiness is the norm, presumably.
So definitely, don't you think so?
Yes, I'm afraid that's probably true. Okay, so I mean, one of the things I find fascinating about your life, having been if you like, even if by accident, you won't go into all the accidents I had, but I've been a career academic, as it were. I know no other sphere, though I did leave Cambridge. I spent 4 years in the States too, in Cornell. But you've done so many different things, and there's always this interesting question. Certainly, even within my narrow sphere of being an academic, most of the things I've done, I've fallen into by mistake. And I think, sometimes you've already mentioned the sort of luck and accident and stuff. I think it's just such an important message to those setting out that whatever you thought when you were 16, 21, 30, it won't be how life pans out.
Oh, absolutely. I think only once deliberately set out to do something, and otherwise it's all been people suggesting, why don't you do this? And I go, why not? And so from the Treasury, I went into the private sector to do economic forecasting, and again, learned a lot about how forecasts work and how the data work, and also about other economies, because I was responsible for thinking about the Soviet Union, which is going through that period of glasnost and perestroika. So that was really interesting. But also just running a big computer model of my own was a great experience. And then the one thing that I wanted to try and had to go at was becoming a journalist. I'd always liked writing, and I applied to The Economist for an internship and got that. And from there went to the Investors Chronicle, and then to the Independent, where eventually I became their economics editor. And so that was a deliberate attempt. And I suppose it was about a dozen years altogether I was in journalism. And then I just got slightly bored. I'd had my children and was struggling with the inflexibility of long hours and commuting. So I then decided to set up my own consultancy. And I did that for a number of years, but also by accident at the same time, somebody suggested I applied to be a member of the Competition Commission. And that was the first of the public service roles I did. So for some years then I mixed consultancy under my own banner and these public service roles. And again, all fantastically interesting because you learn so much in different environments. The Competition Commission was brilliant, a brilliant way to learn about how markets really actually operate, as opposed to the way we talk about them as academic economists. And things like the glass fibre insulation market, or the market for corn syrup, or the market for extended warranties, which might sound unbelievably dull, but absolutely fascinating because they all have their quirks and institutional details. And I still can't walk past somebody renovating their loft without looking to see what kind of insulation materials they bought and who owns the company. And you know, the economy really is, people talk about economics as being abstract and mathematical. It's actually really about these gritty details about how different markets operate, how the owners think about setting the prices, who they think their competitors are, how they think about strategy. It's absolutely fascinating.
I mean, you've said that a lot of your roles have come about because people have asked you to do them. Now that implies you're a very good networker. I mean, how did you make these contacts? Because I think that's something, you know, when you're setting out, it feels very daunting. How do you find people who are useful to you as mentors or as sponsors, or just to tap you on the shoulder at the right moment?
Well, usually there'll be people you have been at university with. So, you know, both Oxford and Harvard have not an impressive network potential. I think, though, for me, the big advantage was having a column about economics in a national newspaper. And that combined with experience in the Treasury was a very attractive combination. Because for all of these public service activities, understanding that nexus of politics and policy in the media is very important to being effective. And I had done all of those, really. I had been in the Treasury and understood the media and engaged with politicians from that perspective also.
I mean, I think that's a more reassuring answer, because the idea that going to Brasenose and Harvard is what enables you to get on in the world is exactly what people would hate. You know, the social capital you get from having started off. I mean, maybe not with a silver spoon in your mouth, but nevertheless, the first steps enabled you to do a lot more. Whereas if you say it's the combination of skills and, you know, the fact that you had done these very different things, I think that's a rather more reassuring answer. And of course, being a journalist, you are very much in the public eye and will be a name that people recognize when they're thinking about who might fill this role.
But maybe it's one way to think about your career, to the extent that people do plan, thinking about the different types of skill and experience, and the fact that having a range is actually an advantage.
Well, I would absolutely subscribe to that. And I've done some, if you like, non-traditional things, which I think has then given me an advantage. But then in a slightly different vein, being someone who's very much been an interdisciplinary scientist, so worked physics at the interface with biology, there's always the fear that if you aren't just mainstream, keeping your head sort of on the straight and narrow, you are disadvantaged. So, you know, my view is rather that in early life, it probably is sensible to stay on the straight and narrow. And then once you've got a bit of a standing reputation and confidence, being able to do the broader range of things that you actually want to do.
Yeah, I know that you, like me, are really interested in how to enable interdisciplinary research. And it is, of course, a great worry that there are young people who know absolutely that the borderlands between the disciplines are where the interesting questions lie, and the potential answers to the interesting questions. But one worries about getting them embarked safely on their career.
Exactly. I mean, the funding tends to be harder. It's a fight I've been having with research councils for about the last 20, 25 years, that things that cross between research councils, and I don't believe UKRI have solved this problem, it's a real problem. But I still think it is where the interesting things happen. And, you know, if you just do what other people have done already, but slightly different, you're not likely to make an enormous difference because you're just going to be incremental. But it's a scary thing to do.
I feel this really strongly at the moment when the challenges that we face are evidently very complex, and no single discipline or no single branch of knowledge is going to be able to address them. We need
and that does mean, I mean, you're a social scientist, I'm a physical scientist, but it absolutely means bringing really different disciplines together like that. I mean, when it comes to climate change, you can come up with all the technological solutions, but if people won't adopt them, then you're not going to get anywhere. I mean, I know that's not your kind of social science, but it's a real challenge. When I think about funding opportunities, though, it does seem to me that those kind of challenge-led, I think is the correct jargon, problems are actually easier to get funded than the ones which are more underpinning, that no one can quite see why they might be useful, but 10 years down the road, they may be absolutely what you need. I think those are much harder to get funded.
I'm not even sure funding is the biggest hurdle. I think departments and journals are even bigger obstacles.
Yeah, career progression.
The way departments think about hiring people, they will look at particular journals, and they can be quite narrow.
Indeed. When I was a young lecturer, Sir Brian Pippard, who was retired but was the former head of the Cavendish, said to me, things have come to a sad pass when people at the Cavendish study starch. And I felt that really wasn't very encouraging for a young lecturer. It was dismal. But I like to think that I proved him wrong, that it was worth studying. But, it's hard. It's hard to keep going in the face of that. And I look at physics, which has suddenly got awfully excited about food. And I think, yeah, well, I did that 20 years ago and no one was excited then. That's just life. Maybe you feel the same about your economics.
Yes, well, I've been doing my kind of economics since the mid-1970s. So I think I was quite early on the digital revolution, and that some of the things in the book that I wrote, the first book that came out in 1997, were quite prescient. So if I look at it now, some of it is obviously wide of the mark, and other bits are absolutely spot on. It's what's happening.
Yes. So why was digital interesting to you right from the beginning?
This came about because I was a cub reporter, and I got sent to cover the flotation of a company nobody had ever heard of called Unipalm. And it was an internet service provider early in the internet era. And the advisors hired a suite in the Savoy to have the roadshow for journalists and investors. And they had a webcam on the Golden Gate Bridge, and you could see the cars driving across in real time. And I was unbelievably excited about what this would mean, and started then volunteering to look at other companies in the sector, to report on them and learning more about the technology. And I suppose had an intuition or just an interest really early in it, and it proved to be as transformative as I had thought at the time. And technologies like this have really big effects, but slowly, or at least very slowly at first, and then very quickly. And a lot of the very quick change has come about since the late 2000s, 2008 or 9, I suppose, when we all got smartphones and 3G, and the market design algorithms meant the apps were working really well. But actually, the roots of those changes lie much further back, of course.
And so you've kept that interest going ever since?
Yes, and so I look now at measuring the digital economy. How does it change our concepts about productivity, competition in digital markets, about how to think of data as an economic asset, and governance and regulation of data. So all of that cluster of digitally related things are at the heart of my interest now.
And is that an area where many economists are active?
In certain aspects of it. But because there's not much data available, and a lot of economists have got so used to being able to download data sets, public data sets, there are fewer than you would hope. So there's certain areas of theory where there are loads of people doing work, and then there are pockets of applied work done in areas where people have got hold of data sets. But there aren't all that many people who think about the broader aspects of it, I suppose. And that's the kind of liberty I have because I'm not a traditional academic. I've not come through the long path of narrowing and focusing on a certain area. And I've got this policy experience now that allows me to think about joining up the dots, wider societal changes. How should economists be talking to computer scientists and engineers and lawyers and regulators about how we not only understand but shape the digital economy so that people broadly benefit from it.
And the lack of data sets, would it be possible to measure these things? I mean, there's always this fear that you know, if you can measure it, then you can do something with it, and if you can't measure it, well, you forget it. I mean, could you measure the things that you want to analyze?
It's not straightforward because some of the issues are conceptual. Measurement in economics isn't just measuring things that exist in nature. They are concepts and definitions. So I think for the digital economy, there's conceptual work to be done too. But we also do lack data. For example, what are the data flows in and out of data centers? And collecting some quite basic information, or to what extent are companies using cloud computing and what are they doing with it? A lot of aspects of what's happening that we just don't have enough information.
And how much of that would be commercially sensitive? I mean,
well, quite a lot of it would be. But on the other hand, all of the economic data that we do have about businesses is commercially sensitive, and it's collected and safeguarded by a highly respected independent statistical agency.
Okay. So it's no different from that. And if you could get that, I mean, I know you're now part of this new Productivity Institute, as well as the Bennett Institute, which is the public policy angle, but the Productivity Institute, I assume, is about productivity. If you could get hold of this data, would it help to solve the productivity paradox that people talk about?
There's no single thing that would help to solve productivity. And a lot of the philosophy of the Productivity Institute is that the productivity challenge is not about the ingredients, it's about the recipe, it's about how they're put together. And that puts a lot of the attention on things like how do firms learn about new processes and adopt them, or what kind of policy decisions should be taken at different levels of government and how do they coordinate with each other, rather than we need to improve skills. Well, we know we need to improve skills. It's something that's much more granular than that, and much more about getting different kinds of people to join up their activities in ways that haven't been done before.
Yeah, I mean, this is the area where your interests and mine start to converge, because although I'm a physicist, I am very interested in the policy angles of, well, partly it is about skills, but it is what skills where and how can you best deliver them. I get very frustrated reading things saying we need to improve skills, and I feel, well, yeah, okay, what do you mean by that? Because it doesn't really tell you very much. And I worry about our education beyond the sort of traditional university courses, which are fine and everyone knows what they are, but it's the other kind of elements of what kind of skilled workforce do we need, and what skills do they need to acquire when, for what purpose. And I think that's where we start to come together in our interests.
I absolutely agree with you, and I think we actually don't have enough granular information or make use of enough local knowledge about this. I was very struck in my Manchester days by visiting somebody who was running a kind of incubator for the creative sector, and people rented spaces to make productions, and it was incredibly successful. But she said her biggest challenge was finding electricians with the right kind of electrician skills. And the local FE college turned out electricians, but somebody had told them something generic about what should be in the curriculum for electricians, and she couldn't get them to train for the specific needs that she needed, and she could have provided plenty of good jobs for those people. So it's that sort of very fine-grained mismatch.
Yes, well, I mean, the latest white paper about skills said that you should get the local employers involved, but that also seems to have been tried many times before without actually transforming the landscape.
I think you've got to get them involved and also devolve the power to make the decisions locally.
And make sure there's enough money in the further education colleges. Yeah. So I should remind people, do put some questions. We haven't got a single question yet, so please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll wrap up soon and open it up to the floor. But how did you become an academic?
I had spent what must it have been about 12 or so years with this half-time consulting, half-time public service roles. Latterly, the BBC Trust, where I became vice chair eventually, which was a very absorbing role in many ways. And I got a call from a dean at the University of Manchester who said, we've got some students who are demanding that the economics course addresses real world problems, practical problems. We want somebody who's got practical experience to do that. Would you be interested? And it was another of those occasions when I said, well, why not? So I became an economics professor at Manchester, devised a course, which ultimately became a textbook. And it was really popular. So there were 100 something students, undergraduates taking it. And I taught economic history there as well. And so that was the start of it. I've not really been an academic for very long. And then a headhunter rang to say, there is this role at Cambridge. Have you thought about applying for that? And I said no, but then I thought, why not? So here I am.
Yes, I mean, we haven't particularly talked about inequality because you are the Bennett Professor of
Public Policy.
Public policy, but there was an emphasis on inequality in that role, as far as I remember from the time. Are there many people, many economists who worry about these things?
There are a lot, actually, and I think for all the reputation of economics as being about greed, most economists are, certainly in academia, very much focused on questions of social justice and making things better. So you might not always agree with the way that people go about it, but I think the intent is there, and particularly, of course, as the phenomenon has become more apparent, and we've realised the extent of inequalities in the past 20 years, then people have responded and started studying that much more.
And it's only getting worse. I mean, the pandemic seems to be driving inequality, both within a single country and between countries.
It's definitely made things worse. And we thought we had problems beforehand about so-called left behind places, disadvantaged families. They're much worse than they were 12 or 15 months ago. So we've got quite a hole to climb our way out of.
So there's a question come in from Ben Martin, which sort of follows on this. I mean, he says, what brought you to Cambridge and the Bennett Institute? We've probably touched on that. But he goes on to say, what are you hoping to achieve, and what would success look like in 5 years?
Oh, well, that's quite a leading question. So we will have grown. We've got about 24 people or so now, from just 2 or 3 when we started 3 years ago. We will have thriving programs of interdisciplinary research, and we'll be both delivering fantastic high quality interdisciplinary research that can get published in disciplinary journals or in Nature or Science, but we'll also have a reputation among policymakers, national, local, international, as a place where you can go to get insights into challenges of inequality, justice, addressing big societal challenges. So we'll have gone from nothing to being a recognised public policy centre with a strong focus on excellent research.
And how, I mean, there is a master's in public policy. What's the best way of helping people to think about policy rather than, if you like, theoretical stuff?
There's just such a wide range of things that it's helpful to know if you're going to be in policy. And the students on that programme are amazing. They've had some work experience before they start. They come from a really wide range of backgrounds, both in terms of their country and the type of work experience and their disciplinary knowledge. And so I think the aim is to make sure that they have a broad enough understanding of the kinds of things that it's really helpful to know to become a good policymaker. So it's adding breadth and signposting, how to get more in-depth knowledge and things that you don't know about. So if you're an engineer, what do you need to know about economics? What do you need to know about political decision making and how that operates? And so that's the aim. It's a one-year program, so it's really quite intense, especially with but I think that the graduates go on to achieve amazing things.
So keep the questions coming. They're not coming yet. And how many of the people from that course, I mean, I guess this applies to the UK master's students, how many of them go on into the civil service?
I don't know the figure. Some of them do. It's a very international group though, so I think the number who actually from the UK and stay in the UK is quite small.
I just wondered, I mean, given your own feelings about, well, at least the Treasury, and I don't know if that it would extend across the civil service, whether you feel that's a career, well, you found it as a good sort of kicking off point, but what else should people who study public policy go on to do?
Well, I think they should go into the civil service because it's, you know, I was there in the mid-1980s. It's changed an awful lot. And, my concerns about civil service careers now would be that the politicians are trying to undermine the independence and status of public servants, but it is a great career. But there are all kinds of things. And I think having that insight about policy helps you in a career in business, because almost all businesses that get to be large have regulatory issues that they need to deal with, understanding that. It's a great background for going into politics, if that's what you want to do, or going into the law. So I suppose in the same way that PPE is a great foundation because it's quite broad. An introduction to public policy of this kind fits you for a whole range of different future career paths.
I mean, you talk of going on to be an MP. One of the things that I think is dismal is how few MPs have any science background. I mean, you just mentioned there's a hypothetical engineer who could come on the MPP. And it does seem to me that we need to make sure that there are scientists who have, you know, the rigorous science training, but then go on into the policy sphere, because otherwise, when you look at the big societal challenges, be it climate change or inequality, you need people who understand all these different aspects.
Why do you think scientists don't go into politics?
Because I don't think anyone ever suggests it. I don't think they know it's something that could be useful, and that was one of the reasons why we were trying to work with CSAT to facilitate that. I think as an undergraduate or even as a PhD student, it's just not really something that's in your sights. And I think that is a shame. I came to policy quite late in my career, totally by accident, as all these things are. But it had never crossed my mind because you just get on with your research, kind of thing. So
well, maybe we can try and change that.
I think we definitely should. So the next question is from Jacob. What advice would you give to someone with a broad range of academic interests, specifically in economics, on how to focus the direction of their career? And he's sort of asking you, would you recommend trying many different things and see what you enjoy, or try taking a very deliberate career path?
Well, I'm hardly somebody to advise taking a deliberate career path. It depends on the kind of person you are, I think. I think people either are interested in the deep dives or they're interested in the breadth. And I'm a breadth person and I like to join the dots. And it's quite hard to give somebody advice about which way to go without knowing what kind of person they are. I think that's a really personal choice. So that's a very unhelpful answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but I think it is, I mean, one of the things he said was try many different things and see what you enjoy. And in a way, that is what you're saying. If that's what you want to do it. So the next question is from Mirameka, who says about inequality. The concept of human capital is germane to the philosophy of Churchill. and Professor Hahn. And the quote is, "The state has invested in you to date. In your time here, we continue to invest in you, and you have access to the broadest schools of thought open to you than exists anywhere else. You must exchange ideas and help each other. For the rest of your lives, you're expected to be applying back in." So I assume this is something that Frank Hahn said to this person. "Please comment on human capital and the return and duty owed to society that is incumbent on anyone with access to open-minded, highly focused education and inspiration offered by Churchill in particular."
That's quite a big question. The idea of human capital in economics is that it's people's accumulated skills that deliver the ability to do valuable work, and they will benefit from that, and society will benefit from that too. So there are public good aspects of it. In measurement and modeling of human capital, there's a great emphasis on academic qualifications, and often it's measured by wage differentials. It's an imperfect concept because there is human capital that's not rewarded by the market. I think a great example is the fact that key workers are not among the highest paid in our society. It was we discovered in the past year. And it omits the kinds of skills that are difficult to measure or are not well measured by qualifications. And it omits issues like health. And it overlaps with social capital. So another of these broad social science concepts. And that's about the similarly long-term advantages that you gain from the kind of family that you live in, or the community and the society that you live in as well. And that affects people's human capital. So there's an interaction there that we need to understand. But there's also just the basic point that we're social creatures and we are shaped by our societies and we shape them. And I think understanding that chain of what's given to you and what you need to give is just really quite fundamental to leading a rewarding life and having a sense of purpose. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, they can't come back, I'm afraid, because so we haven't touched at all on gender, but there's a question here from Fran Mallory. Are there ways of increasing the number of senior female economists? Because economics is just as bad as physics, if not worse, in the number of females. And you know, what can be done about this?
I wish there were an easy fix. It's something that concerns me greatly. Economics is male-dominated. It's got even fewer members of ethnic minorities than women in terms of proportion. And there are no figures that I know of, but I would suspect even fewer working class people of working class backgrounds. You're not a social science if you're so unrepresentative of your society. It's the kind of questions that you think to ask, the barriers that you understand in people's lives if you're thinking about inequality, the data that gets collected, that's all affected by the lack of representativeness. But is there an easy way to fix it? Well, I think the profession's actually trying reasonably hard now. Role models, going into schools, telling girls that actually economics is not all about making money in the city. It's about society. It's about things that you care about, like the environment and inequality. Programs, mentoring. The hardest bit to change seems to be the culture, and this idea, it's quite an aggressive culture in the academic world and seminars, and this idea that a certain kind of brilliance is what counts as being a good economist. That's quite narrow, and many people don't have that kind of brilliance, but I think it's something that many girls coming through school have socialized out of them to be. I don't know if you think the same thing about physics, but it's not the way that you learn to behave and comport yourself.
I think that is true. I think culture has a huge impact on that. And I mean, the Institute of Physics has done loads of work in this country trying to get more schoolgirls interested in physics. And you know, the numbers doing physics A-level have barely changed in the last 20 years, despite all that work. And I think it is societal. I think you may say you go into schools and tell the children that it's not all about making money in the city, And, you know, it's like going in and saying, well, you know, there's a lot of social stuff in physics too, because, you know, you can be a medical physicist or whatever. I mean, there's so much stuff, or you can, you know, contribute to solving issues of climate change. You know, there are lots of things which really are relevant, but somehow that message just doesn't penetrate. And it may be not unrelated to the next question from David Luca, who says how to convince mainstream economists to broaden our mindsets. And I think this is particularly about moving away from where you have data sets, but to think about things where perhaps it's a little fuzzier, and think about these things because they're still really important.
Again, not an easy answer to this, and people are trying. There have been several, 5 or so Nobel Prize economists complaining about how narrow the academic subject has been and the narrow funnel of the main journals in economics. And it's how do you get out of this particular equilibrium or trap that we found ourselves in when the incentives are so strong for people to carry on doing what economists do, because that's what gets rewarded by economists. And these sorts of shifts in subjects seem to take quite a lot of time. I think because so much of the interesting economics is happening outside economics departments, that will start to shift things. And in Cambridge, we have many colleagues in the economics department who are doing some very broad and interesting work and feel these frustrations themselves from within the department. So I think it will shift, but you know, these kinds of things happen slowly until they happen quickly.
Yes, and then suddenly you only do that kind of economics, and the old kind just sort of fades away completely. So there's a question from Ken Siddle. If you as an academic or indeed a civil servant have a great policy idea, what's the bigger hurdle to implementation? Selling your idea to politicians or politicians selling it to a skeptical public?
You've got to do both. I think of it in terms of the climate of ideas as well as the specifics. So you might have a fantastic idea about a single policy, but the ground has to be fertile because there's enough kind of shared understanding about the way things operate that your fantastic idea will land. And that's one of the reasons I've always thought public communication is really important. And I've you know, trained as a journalist, but also continue to do lots of columns for newspapers, because not only do politicians read them, this is a conversation among people who care about particular issues. And if you don't persuade and bring people along with you, then your best ideas will probably fade away and nothing will get done about them.
But you had a career as a journalist, so you can get your columns written. Now Ken, I happen to know, is a retired academic. You know, it's much harder for the average person in academia, for instance, to get something published in a mainstream paper. They can write a blog, and sometimes that takes off. And you know, you can think of examples of people who've got very well-read blogs, which even policymakers read. But for the average person, that's, you know, they're not going to get themselves published in the FT as you do, or you know, Independent, or wherever it may be. So how do you get your views out there?
Well, then you take advantage of other people's blogs and social media. And let me advertise the Bennett Institute blog. If people want to write policy blogs, we will be very happy to look at them. And you know, you use that kind of platform, or the Conversation is another platform, or the LSE blogs take blogs from people. So you would use somebody else's, and they do get widely read. And then it's down to how persuasive you are, how well you write it, how good your idea is. And like any marketplace, the marketplace for ideas competes on quality. And
I can confirm that the Bennett will take blogs from random people, because I've had 2 or 3 published there. It's 6 o'clock. If I don't know how well the microphone picks it up, I have a clock that dings the hour, and I always feel kind of embarrassed. It makes this tinkling noise, but it probably means that I can see that people are starting to drop off and go and cook their supper. So thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you. I look forward to the time when we can meet in hall or in the first dining room again. It's a strange way to conduct an interview, but thank you for being willing to be my victim.
Thank you, Athene. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you to all those who spent yet another hour watching.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.